That was the sound of Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun. The recording originally appeared on the album A Saucer Full of Secrets, the first Floyd album to appear in the wake of the departure of Syd Barrett. The album emerged at a difficult time for Floyd, with the band still searching for a new musical identity following the loss of their frontman and principal writer. Set the Controls was one of the few tracks from the album that seemed to have real potential as a composition.
Set the Controls to the Heart of the Sun was a track that emerged when Syd Barrett was still in the band. They were playing it live during their tour with Jimi Hendrix, the package tour in '67, before Syd left. And I think it was a track that showed the development of where they were going with extending live jams and improvisations and so on. And it was also very accessible because it's quite a simple idea.
Certainly quite a lot of the things that are on the second album became staples of the live set for a long time. I mean, you think that Saucer Full of Secrets came out in 1968 and they were still doing things like Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun and the title track well into 1971, 1972 in concert. And also I think that this was the way that the sound was going. It was going away from having a sort of front man and more into this kind of wonderful kind of painting, sound paintings, you know.
April 1970, when the band arrived in the studios of KQED to record their live show, Set the Controls was still very much a mainstay of the set, forming the highlight of the Floyd stage show.
Although it's Roger Waters' bass that leads the track off and provides that pulse all the way through it, the thing that's really underrated about Pink Floyd a lot of the time is Nick Mason's drumming. And the style that he has in this track, with the soft mallets and that almost kind of Middle Eastern, almost tribal feel to it, I think is really the thing that holds that sound together. So you've got him, you've got Waters, and then along comes Rick with all the keyboard fills, and David as well, and that just fills the whole thing out. It really builds so well.
I very much see Saucer Full as a transitional album in that it was started while Syd was still in the band, but then they realised that they couldn't work with him anymore. I mean, he was really going off the rails. And there's a great story about how he was doing this song with them called Have You Got It Yet?
We went to this rehearsal hall and he said, I've written a new song. And we all went, great, you know, fantastic. We'll learn it then. And he went, it goes like this. And he played this quite sort of fairly complicated rhythmic thing over some very simple chord changes. And then he said, and then the chorus goes, have you got it yet? Have you got, you see, like that. And so we went, oh yeah, right, okay, well, how does it go? And he played it again. And so we said, okay, we'll try it now. And we started playing it. And he played it differently, see? And then we got to the chorus. And he went on doing this, and it was at least 20 minutes before we suddenly started to twig that no, we hadn't got it, and there was no way we were going to get it, because every time he played it, he changed it.
There's another great story that he was at a club somewhere, probably the UFO club, and he went on stage and he just stood there with his guitar around his neck and his arms dangling to his sides and didn't play. And so they decided that they'd have to get another guitarist in to kind of fill it out, and Syd would be there as a kind of like fifth member feeding in material and stuff, but not necessarily ever, you know, a Brian Wilson type of figure.
It's awfully considerate of you to think of me here, and I'm most obliged to you for making it clear that I'm not here.
Whether Syd had a mental breakdown, had a lack of confidence, or just took too much of whatever he was taking, which made him go completely off at a tangent, we'll never know. Because they always say that stuff just highlights what's inside your head. So who knows?
Who could be writing this song?
Even today, there's a sizable minority who regards Syd Barrett as the true genius behind Pink Floyd and dismiss pretty much everything else which came afterwards. The protective cloak cast by the sad decline of Syd Barrett still envelops his brief legacy, which now seems to be critic-proof.
I have a huge personal fondness for Syd Barrett and a huge sense of, I guess, loss now that he's no longer there, even though he hadn't functioned for a long time. It was just such a part of your life, you know. And I don't think he was overrated. I think he was a brilliant flair of a talent. And one of those things, somewhat akin to Buddy Holly, that they created so much that was memorable in such a short space of months more than years, that you wonder where it would have gone and if it would have gone if they had lasted.
I think perhaps with his fans, the people, you know, of those similar kind, the psychedelic people, they probably did think he was some sort of a genius. As to myself, well, no, I mean, I don't like the use of that word generally anyway. It's overdone. Yeah, definitely. I mean, not only in the case of Syd Barrett, but in other ways as well. It's an overused word which is not always, or mainly, appropriate.
He was as much responsible for the kind of space rock stuff as the other members of the band. And also, I think that he is a dark corner of the Pink Floyd that will never go away. And he keeps reappearing. You look at Saucerful of Secrets, which is a transitional album, but then you get into the 70s and you look at things like Dark Side of the Moon, which is about madness, and you look at Wish You Were Here, and Syd is there. I mean, the songs are written about him, and I think that if you were to really corner Waters and Gilmour, they'd have to say that Syd, even now, is even as a long gone member of the band, he's still got some kind of strange vibe that somehow still is in the music.
It's like the legend. It's like Pete Best got thrown out of the Beatles. It's part of the legend. It's like you can't imagine it any other way. Syd does 2 albums, goes nuts, and then we move on.
Anyone wants to start raking over the horrors of band breakups, but occasionally something like that can act as a catalyst, can actually make you realise that there's still things you want to do, that there are other ways of doing things that you were not able to do in the past.
David Gilmour initially had to endure the uneasy feeling of not only having usurped his former friend's place in the band, he also had to perform a stage set that was initially made up almost entirely of Barrett compositions.
when Gilmour arrived, there was a phase where he almost had to try to be Syd, because the set would be things like Astronomy Domini and Interstellar Overdrive, so he had to be in that role and just gradually evolve and become more of himself, which I think was part of his arrival at discovering his own voice.
So I learnt to sing all Syd's parts and play his guitar parts, more or less. My guitar style and Syd's guitar style were not even close, so it was very difficult to know exactly what to do. It took a while for me to settle in.
It was easier to bring a new person into the band with David because he'd grown up with Syd and Roger in Cambridge, and so they didn't have an audition process. His guitar style had evolved along similar lines to Syd. They were very different kinds of players, but they'd grown up together, they had a lot of shared interests, they'd gone on busking holidays to France and all this kind of stuff, so there was a lot of shared experience between David and the band before he started to play with Pink Floyd. But on the other hand, Syd had been such a central provider of material and such a strong central figure in the Pink Floyd that David had to step in and take up that role. And there were expectations of him that were based on people who thought that Syd had been edged out by the rest of the band to make way for David, which was grossly unfair.
His head did no thinking, his arms didn't move, except when the wind cut up rough and mice ran around on the ground.
I don't think they knew where they were going at all when I joined. I think it seemed to be like we could maybe, how should I put it, maybe milk a bit more out of a dying thing. Which is what we've been doing ever since, according to some.
There's little doubt that Gilmour's contribution to the first album was rather tentative. However, if one sets aside the painful circumstances of his arrival, many Floyd fans swear that the early Gilmour era was in fact the real golden era for Pink Floyd, especially once Gilmour had found his feet as a vocalist.
The path you tread is narrow, and the drop is sheer and very high. The ravens all are watching from a vantage point nearby. Apprehension creeping like a tube train up your spine. Will the tightrope reach the end? Will the final couplets rhyme?
I think David Gilmour was a really interesting find. I mean, he was part and parcel of that Cambridge scene. He was in that band Jokers Wild. And I think Dave was just such a different kind of figure to Syd. I mean, Syd was this incredibly wild, creative character, and Dave was a very kind of laid-back guy. Alan Parker, the film director, I think once said he'd never met anyone who was so at ease with themselves as Dave Gilmour. And I think if you listen to some of the music that came after that, there's some very laid-back music that the Floyd did, and also Dave was a fantastic blues guitarist as well, and I think that's, you know, definitely came out.
Well, when Dave came, he was more interested in the melodic side of music. When Dave was there, I used to have little jam sessions. I sat at the piano and we'd extemporize things, and you know, some of the old jazz classics, which they did happen to know perhaps the songs. So we'd have little jam sessions there, and that was terribly relaxing and enjoyable, much more when Dave Gilmour was joined the group. It became that much easier.
The direction started taking place quite quickly after I joined. There was a direction that seemed to start coming forward, but I don't think that started till after Syd had gone. I don't think it was possible to really think of much of moving forwards while Syd was still there.
Your manager and agent are both busy on the phone, selling coloured photographs to magazines back home.
Cymbeline was one of the pieces from More, which was integrated into the highly ambitious live show that the band developed during 1969. The live show was entitled The Man and the Journey and subtitled The Massed Gadgets of Auximines, More Furious Madness from Pink Floyd. Lyrically, Cymbeline is the first overt expression of Roger Waters' disillusionment with the music business, and in the Auximines set, the track was used to represent the man's nightmare.
It strikes you that they're moving into range. Doctor Strange is always changing his side.
Cymbeline's a track that's on the soundtrack to a film called More, which is about people going off to seek a hedonistic lifestyle in Ibiza and spiralling downwards into heroin addiction. And it's not a pleasant watch. It's not a film that has a happy ending, and it's not something that really celebrates the hippie dream. And the soundtrack to it was quite unusual in that it had a fair number of songs on it, and Cymbeline was certainly one of the stronger pieces of lyric and line. And yeah, it's developing, but it's still quite early stages as far as Pink Floyd songwriting is concerned.
It's groovy.
Butterfly with broken wings is falling by your side.
You've got to look at the Floyd in their kind of original context, which is they were part of this new underground culture that was coming out, and it spread far beyond just music and fashion. It was informing all different walks of life, writing, painting, and 60s filmmaking was very radical. And I think directors started to see the potential of using Pink Floyd's music and sound to inform and make their film work better. And they had all the connections. I mean, there was a lot of directors who were tapping into the underground, not just here, but in Europe and in America and what have you. And I guess that they started to get offers from people to work on films.
They're moving into range, and Doctor Strange is always changing his side. And
when Floyd make soundtrack albums, they sound really like soundtrack albums. They are probably one of the few bands that do very well at that area. They're really good, and their music does lend itself fantastically to those sort of fantastic films. So, and they probably found it really they're very, they're very artistic people and very articulate people. They probably found it quite, exhilarating is the word I was looking for, to do something like that. So they probably got a lot out of it.
It's an interesting area, but it's possibly something we're more likely to do as individuals than as the band, because it tends to take up an album, and that's sort of valuable time that's perhaps better spent, because the time taken on an actual Pink Floyd album that's not directed by or motivated by any other outside force. But it's a very good discipline, I think, in terms of making records, because you're suddenly called upon to do a very different sort of job, and you're not given a free hand at all. You're asked to do music to very specific moods and very specific lengths. So I think it's a good discipline, but we're not into discipline.
Pink Floyd became a very different band from 68, 69 onwards. But around the time this film's made, they've got into this groove that they had at that time, and there's a level of criticism can be made of this that says that a lot of it sounds the same and a lot of it's quite mid-tempo. And I think when you listen to what they're doing at that stage, that's true.
For me, as a Floyd fan, it was like a little aside, waiting for the next proper record. That's how I saw that.
Recorded over a very short spell of time in early 1969, the Moore album exhibits all of the disadvantages that would suggest. Unusually for a film soundtrack album, there are a large number of songs on Moore as opposed to mood pieces. Cymbeline soon became a stage favourite.
Things like Cymbeline can kind of like stand on their own, but they're not particularly essential. I don't think that they're pieces of music that are classic or particularly totally indispensable. I mean, if you had to kind of like put that up against See Emily Play or Vegetable Man or something, then it would be the Syd stuff that was good. But I think in a sense it's kind of like quite nice mood music, and it's quite sort of gentle, laid back, you know, sort of harking back to the kind of West Coast sound that was happening at the same time.
Cymbeline and Green is the Colour were the two strongest melody tracks on Moore. There were other songs on there. There was Nile Song and Ceres Minor on the Moore soundtrack. Saucerful, I think, had a few melodic things on it too. One of the best things on Saucerful is Remember a Day, which is a Rick Wright song. I think that's good. And you're at a phase where they're just trying to learn to be writers, and Waters is discovering who he is as far as being a lyricist is concerned, and it didn't come immediately.
Green is the Colour was the other track from the album, which became a staple of the live set during 1970 and 1971.
The tracks on Moore tended to be quite concise, probably because they were written as film cues, so the songs that are on that album fit with short mood pieces which would go along with the action in the film. And Green is the Colour and Cymbeline, I think, are probably around the 3 minutes or thereabout mark on the film. But of course, Pink Floyd live, everything would extend.
If you look at the 68-69 period, they were really kind of experimenting around in lots of different areas, trying to find where they wanted to go, and so they were coming up with all kinds of stuff. I mean, they were still, you know, doing the long improvised space rock things, and then they could write these nice sort of gentle things, and they could also, as you say, they could do these kind of like hard rock tracks as well.
Green is the Colour is particularly interesting as a pointer towards the pastoral side of Floyd, which flourished briefly with songs such as If, Fat Old Sun and Grantchester Meadows.
There's kind of like quite a nice sort of folky sort of element there. I mean, I think Grantchester Meadows is the beginning for me of the pastoral Pink Floyd, which I personally really liked, and it was something that they only did for a little bit of time, just at the end of the 60s or the early 70s.
I think the pastoral element in Pink Floyd maybe has a lot to do with David Gilmour, and possibly acted as a very good balance against the more cynical tastes and thoughts of Roger Waters.
See the splashing of the kingfisher flashing to the water. The river of green is sliding unseen beneath the trees.
Even the most fervent Floyd fan may find some of the moments on these discs less than riveting viewing. The work of Pink Floyd you'll find here is very much that of a band finding its feet. Reflecting on his early days with the band, Gilmour famously stated that he felt his arrival merely extended the declining prospects of something which he and the bandmates felt was dying. History records that Floyd went on to grasp the opportunity which Gilmour's arrival presented, but it certainly wasn't an overnight process. Gilmour took a long time to develop into one of the most confident and distinctive guitarists in rock history, and the viewer will find little here to suggest otherwise. Waters too needed time to evolve into arguably the finest wordsmith of the last 30 years, but you won't find many pointers on Ummagumma.
Gone to ground. See the splashing of the kingfisher flashing to the water.
I always think the musical direction of the band might be likened to four drunks wrestling for control of a car wheel.
Ummagumma is a strange hybrid double album which features an album's worth of live recording and a whole studio album for which each of the four members contributed unique individual pieces.
Ummagumma set the controls for the Heart of the Sun. This is where they took off. They had the whole thing, for me, Ummagumma, everything from the album cover through to that. This was Floyd, first gear, getting set to become massive.
I have a memory of working as an assistant, a tape op on some of the Piper at the Gates of Dawn sessions, and I was extremely impressed because that was wonderful. So you know, you had this expectation that this was going to be great. You were going to come in and you were going to do all these wonderful songs, and it didn't turn out quite like that.
On a personal note, I really like Ummagumma, but looking at it in the kind of great canon of Pink Floyd work, I don't think it's a particularly important album. It seems kind of like going off at a bit of a tangent, because what you've got is you've got an album of live stuff, which is really harking back to the Piper and Saucerful of Secrets era, and this was the stuff that they were doing live. But then, what was quite radical for the time was that all four members of the band each had a piece of music on there, which was solo, really.
They all came in and we all sat there, and Norman said to him, "Well, have you got some songs?" And they said no, and had to decide what they were going to do in terms of what they were going to do for this record. They had to make a record, they got sessions, but what were they going to do? And after much discussion, it was decided that they would have a quarter of the record each to do whatever they wanted, and that the others would, the other three would assist the one whose quarter it was to do. Now, I mean, at that stage, probably there would have been other producers who would have said, "No, sorry, we'll cancel the sessions, go away, write some songs, come back and we'll do them." Whereas Norman went with it, and we ended up with what we ended up with.
I tried to encourage them in their own sort of producing at home. They all had little studio things that they could do, record on, and just simply bring them into the studio with me, and I'll go through them, etc. So I encourage them to more and more produce themselves, and particularly on the, I think it was the third album, Ummagumma, and where they each had a section of that album to themselves. They could do exactly whatever they wanted, and I wouldn't interfere. They could do, unless I could help them with their little. I had to help Nick Mason quite a bit with his quarter, and so that sort of encouragement, if you like, started really and truly during the making of Ummagumma. The encouragement being to eventually produce themselves.
We each did a 10-minute sort of solo piece. It was a period when we were very involved with a man called Ron Geeson.
He's a Scottish lunatic.
Exactly. And he did the choral parts for Atom Heart Mother for us. But he also, I think, taught all of us quite a lot about tape recorders and how to use them and the tricks you could do with them.
I was always recording tin pans and well, my first album's got milk bottles being broken or glass being shattered, but it almost builds up to a rhythm of glass shattering. So it may be that we all just were developing from similar lines or along similar lines from similar points of view at that time.
It's an integration between the music and the effects. You can't really separate the two out. I mean, you can listen to any of the four parts, and they all have the integration of effects and music or sounds or experimentation or whatever you want to call it. But as an engineer, it's great because it gave you the opportunity to try things out, particularly as a young engineer, just starting off. Because there's a lot of double speed and half speed stuff going on in there, backward stuff going on in there. Be interesting to pull it apart and actually see what it was at the time, what they're saying.
I know that they tried a technique of mine for running tape through two machines to get a very long delay and building that delay up into a whole orchestra, a whole vista of amazing sound. But they didn't get on with it because you have to be of a certain type to put the right stuff in to get this particular mix, this mixture. So we're exchanging things there. Ideas, ways of playing. It's fair exchange.
The river of green is sliding unseen beneath the trees.
The overall weakness of the studio album is amply demonstrated by the fact that Grantchester Meadows is arguably the best of the studio tracks.
Grantchester Meadows might actually be an underrated minor classic, because Grantchester Meadows is one of the first places where we hear Waters' voice with the preoccupations that would take him right through the rest of his career with the band and with the solo stuff. And the preoccupations are with the war, with dysfunctional relationships, especially in families. And in the case of Grantchester Meadows, you've got this kind of elegiac looking back to something you've lost. You've got the passing in the sunshine of a bygone afternoon, bringing sounds of yesterday into this city room. And a lot of the time, it's the same thing that infuses his feelings of loss for Syd. Shine on you crazy diamond, and searches for shelter from pigs on the wing. And I think Grantchester Meadows is the first flowering of that.
The piece is gentle and pleasant, but it lacks a standout melody or the innovative instrumental flourish which would mark out the later Floyd from the rest of the world.
Basking in the sunshine of the bygone afternoon.
With this track, we are reaching the end of the pastoral era of Pink Floyd, which flowered briefly with tracks like The Scarecrow and ends with the gentle, wistful melodies of If and Fat Old Son on Atom Heart Mother. Although the song marks the end of an era in that particular sense, the prominent use of sound effects again looks forward to the future of Pink Floyd.
Splash into the water. A river of green is sliding unseen beneath the trees.
Pink Floyd had an interest in sound effects from quite early on. They had Bike on the first album, and they had all the kazoos on Corporal Clegg, and they were interested in tape experiments. Indeed, there was one point when Nick Mason was editing a piece of tape at EMI Studios in the days when they still had white-coated studio attendants. And they came in and found him with a razor blade over a piece of tape, and it nearly caused a union walkout.
At that time, there was a chap in charge of the studios who thought it was a good idea to limit the amount of hours that engineers worked. So an edict went round that engineers could only work, or artists could only work on half an hour after the allotted time of the sessions was booked for, which kind of went against the grain for the time because people were working into the early hours of the morning. So there is actually, I think it's 3 chitties that I had to sign because we went on past 10:30 on some of those sessions. Actually went on to midnight. It lasted about 3 months, and everybody saw how absurd it was. Particularly the artists, you can't say to them, people like Floyd, no, sorry mate, you've got to stop. I'm in the middle of full flow of some wonderful idea I've got, no, sorry mate, out. It's ridiculous. So that didn't last very long. But it did last over the period of those sessions. They were experimenting with what they wanted to do musically, and as engineer and producer we were trying to enhance what they wanted, or if they said, can you give us a certain effect in order to enhance what we're trying to do, we were trying to find some effect which would do exactly that, enhance what they were trying to do. It's working together.
They used a lot of sound effects in those days. But I mean, you'd say they weren't pioneers of ambient music or found objects stuck together. Because some of the American more classical electronic music composers had done that before, so the Floyd were kind of borrowing some of those techniques, but they work very well. And I've always said that Roger Waters was a grandmaster at timing. He was not a great bass player, didn't need to be. His art is in timing. It's the when to do something, now or not.
Grantchester Meadows, I think it's also important for the way that Roger Waters sings. On the live performance we have Roger and David singing together, and that was a new dimension, because on Ummagumma it's part of the album which featured each of the Pink Floyd doing solo things. So it's entirely Roger's idea, and he certainly did like tape manipulations and sound effects, and we have that in abundance in the live performance and on the LP. But the way that Roger's voice has developed there is moving away from, I think, being purely a pop singer and trying to do a sort of psychedelic club shout, and that might well make it a pointer to what was to come later.
Retrospectively, the Ummagumma album has been described as a disaster by Roger Waters, and who are we to argue? The rather indulgent experiments of the studio album definitely sit uncomfortably against the excellent live recordings on the first disc, and one of the best of these is Careful With That Axe.
Careful With That Axe, Eugene, originally turned up as a B-side to a single called Point Me at the Sky, and was probably on there because they couldn't come up with anything of a kind of B-side variety, so they used one of their live performance numbers and slotted it on there, and it makes a very, very strange thing to find on the B-side of a 45. It also typifies that era when Pink Floyd's sound was based on Nick Mason's drums going boom chug ba boom boom chug, and Roger's bass going boom 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 boom, and there's lots of Pink Floyd numbers at that time which do that.
If you listen to the albums in the early 70s, there was a lot of let's just play D minor and wander about over the top of it. And then, I know, we could suddenly start playing very loud, still over D minor, you know, no chord changes. And I'm thinking specifically of Careful with That Axe Eugene. So it was the least subtle possible music that you could imagine, you know, because it involved absolutely nothing. It involved no chord changes. All it involved was, it was still rock and roll by my definition, because it involved a sense of worry about sharp things, you know, Careful with That Axe Eugene. So the title was the whole song, really, and there was a scream in the middle of it, and it all got loud, and then it all got quiet again. So there were, if you like, new ways of writing pieces developed out of the fact that none of us could write songs by any normal, accepted method. But we had to start trying.
You could see where they were headed with things like Careful with That Axe Eugene, and that would take them onwards to the next big stage, which would be Echoes, which had the pastoral thing, but also had a build and had a more rock approach in the end.
It's ragged, it's individual, but I can't say that it's great form in the sense of structure in composition. I always thought it lacked melody, but of course the words in the Floyd's case were the melody. You could convert those words into melody in the future. One could do that as an artistic exercise or project.
In 1970, Pink Floyd seemed to specialize in repetitive phrases, employing limited chord patterns, one in the case of Careful with That Axe, which relied on changing dynamics and an increasingly ominous turn of volume rather than melody to help to build mood.
With Careful with That Axe, we have Roger's fondness for vocal noises and abstract mouth sounds. So you've got them with this whispering menace, and then this incredible scream in the middle of the whole thing. And that's really the turning point for that piece. I would imagine it was probably very exciting to see them do that live at the time. And I think it stands up for the performance there, and David's guitar lifts it to another place that's not just quite the same repetitive drone as the beginning.
By April 1970, Careful with That Axe had become a central part of the live show, and the Floyd really began to develop the piece to its limits. Careful with That Axe was something of an experimental workshop for Floyd at this time. The same number, retitled Beset by Creatures of the Deep, was incorporated into concerts as part of the Man and the Journey opus.
They were really doing a lot of stuff at that time, and I think just trying out lots of different things, because I remember seeing them play at Manchester in the middle of 1969, and the whole of the concert was, to begin with, it was them trying out their 360-degree stereo sound system, which was called the Azimuth Coordinator. But it was very kind of experimental, because the first half of the show was about the day in the life of a man. And so you had things like Work, where you had the band banging nails into things, you know, with hammers, saw and everything. And then they had a tea break where a roadie walked on with a tray with cups of tea. And you know, that was the whole of the first part of the show. And then in the second part, they did do some of the stuff which ended up on Ummagumma. I think some of the Rick Wright and David Gilmour stuff. And they didn't pay any attention to their past or anything. And it was only in the encore when they did Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, where they showed themselves as a real kind of like rock band.
The experimentation of Ummagumma was soon recognised as a failure, and the album was quickly disowned by the band. But ultimately, the learning process bore fruit with Atom Heart Mother, the album which gave the band its first UK #1.
I think Ummagumma was, in a way, probably a failed experiment, and quite an interesting one. You could say the significant thing was that we didn't do it again.
Probably the band would say that maybe it wasn't completely as how they would want it. Maybe there's a few fillers in there, but it was how the future was going to be for Pink Floyd. It was like, it was all big, it was majestic, it was like an event when an album came out, it was something special. Great record. Our blinding cover, really blinding cover, great record, great, some real gems in it.
I think that Source Full of Secrets had been transitional. The Moore album had been a sort of soundtrack work, and Ummagumma again was it didn't quite it established the Floyd as being able to be very sort of diverse and experimental, but I don't think it particularly stamped a great presence there on the rock scene, other than the fact that they were by then a really popular live band with people, you know, smoking dope and what have you.
I listened to it a few days ago. And it's not something I would want to listen to over and over again, that's for sure. But you have to listen to these things in the context of the time in which they were done. You know, in the development of the band and things like that. And in that regard, it's quite interesting. I mean, you know, Grantchester Meadows is a nice enough song. You can tell there's or at least I think there's quite a lot of waffling going on. Ideas being tried out, things that, you know, embryonic stage. But obviously it's a step on the way to the things that they did later on, to step on the way to Dark Side of the Moon, I guess.
Just what the casual viewer tuning into KQED must have made of it all is anyone's guess. The music produced by Pink Floyd circa 1970 certainly has avant-garde pretensions, but the execution is underwhelming in the extreme. This time, the band seemed incapable of solving the creative vacuum which had surrounded the group. The real creative spark did not appear until the release of Medal in late 1971, and it's very difficult to trace those origins from here. But if you look closely, the pointers are there.
I think this performance is a hard watch. I've had a look at it and have enjoyed what I've seen and the way that it's put together. It's very much of its time, and if people are expecting the Pink Floyd of Dark Side of the Moon or Wish You Were Here or whatever, they will not find it here. But if you're interested in the accession and the development of a band who have been a global phenomenon for 4 decades, then KQED shows a part of it that's not really that well documented on record and tends to get overlooked.
The band started to get a sound. It was early, but they started to get a sound. They started to, you know, Gilmour with his guitar sound, and everyone started to get their own little niche in the band, and things started to manoeuvre a bit, and they started to find their way, and that you were getting a Floyd sound from the early days with Syd. You know, they'd done things in between, which was like the soundtrack stuff, which was probably a good buffer while they started to get themselves together as a band. And it was the first time they all started to get a sound.
During the most excruciating moments, it's important to remember that Floyd did go on from this point to achieve genuine greatness, which has given total oral and intellectual satisfaction to millions of listeners. The years of genius were just around the bend, and now, at last, you have the opportunity to discover for yourself how sharp a turn that proved to be. By 1971, as if by magic, the same band which had delivered this lackluster performance had begun to create a body of work which is uniformly purposeful, dramatic, and melodic in a way that no other group has ever come close to. On balance, we feel it's worth taking the pain to understand where Floyd came from. Hearing it again, you may well disagree.